Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time, by Carroll Quigley. Chapter 18. The Rise of Khrushchev, 1953 to 1958. Part 7, A. The United States was saved from the consequences of this short-sighted and ignorant policy by two factors. A. The Soviet Union had no intention of risking any direct clash with the United States, and B. The Soviet Union, during most of this period, was in the midst of an intense internal struggle, which made it impossible for it to follow any course of sustained aggression. At the end of the war, Stalin's rule in Russia was as firmly established as it had ever been. He was head of the government as well as leader of the Communist Party, with the army completely subordinate to his will. The army played only a small role in the domestic politics of the country, but Stalin had shown his power over it in the Great Purge of 1937, when he had destroyed at least 5,000 of its officers on falsified charges of disloyalty. The survivors were under close scrutiny, both from secret police units established, for security reasons, throughout its organization, and from the party commissars attached to its major units. The secret police, under the Ministry of State Security, was a state within a state, with its own armed forces, including armored divisions and completely autonomous air units. It controlled millions of prisoners and slave laborers, large industrial enterprises, and wide territories, chiefly in northern Asia. Stalin was exempt from the authority of these secret police, and at the same time had his own secret police powers within the party organization. Because the party statutes of 1934, prepared by Lazar Kaganovich, had given him an independent police apparatus for use within the party, this was controlled from his personal secretariat, under Lieutenant General A.N. Poskrebyshev. The party, like the police, had units, originally called cells, in almost every industrial enterprise, in many collective farms, in residential neighborhoods, in rows thence, in a hierarchy of cities, regions, provinces, and nations, parallel to the governmental system. Stalin nullified possible opposition by encouraging division and rivalry, not only among the diverse hierarchies of power radiating downward from his own position in government, in party, army, police, and economic life, but also within each hierarchy, by encouraging the ambitious to seek to rise, step by step, through vacancies created by his periodic purges. These purges not only opened the way upward for younger, more ruthless men, but served as justifications for Stalin's growing paranoia. Within the party, the purges of 1924 to 1929 had eliminated, usually by death, most of the old Bolsheviks, those who had been party members before the 1917 revolution. In 1929 to 1934, using a new and younger group, Stalin had killed 10 million Russians, his own estimate, in the drive to establish collective farms. The Second Great Purge of 1934 to 1939 had killed off a large part of the Stalinists who had assisted Stalin's rise to power, and about 5,000 officers of the armed forces. The Third Great Purge, which was shaping up at the end of 1952, was intended to eliminate the rest of the Stalinists who had come to positions of power, in succession to the old Bolsheviks in 1929 to 1935. They were already a dwindling group, from Stalin's insatiable thirst for blood, as can be seen by examining the fate of the members of the 17th Party Congress of 1934, the Congress which first raised Khrushchev and Lavrenti Beria to the Central Committee. Of the 1,966 delegates to the 17th Congress, 1,108 were arrested for anti-revolutionary crimes, in sequel to assassination of Asim Krivov, party leader in Leningrad, which Stalin himself had arranged in December 1934. Of the 139 members and alternates elected to the Central Committee by the Congress of 1934, 98, or 70%, were arrested and shot. Among the survivors were Kaganovich, Vyacheslav Molotov, Georgy Malenkov, Beria, Anastas Mikoyan, K. Voroshilov, and Khrushchev. The new purge of 1953 was apparently aimed at some or most of these survivors. This terror was made worse by the fact that it did not originate only from Stalin, although it undoubtedly required his acquiescence to proceed very far. Such acquiescence could often be obtained by his top subordinates, for the autocrat undoubtedly appreciated those who were prepared to demonstrate their complete ruthlessness in his service. At the end of the war, Khrushchev, although not yet near the top of the pile, had shown more bloodthirsty ruthlessness combined with more groveling obsequiousness to Stalin than anyone else in Russia. At the war's end, the top trio in the gang were Stalin, Malenkov, and Andrei Zakhandanov. The last pair hated each other. Malenkov, in 1945 to 1946, was the most active figure in the government, especially as chairman of the Committee for the Rehabilitation of Liberated Areas and chairman of the committee in charge of dismantling German industry for reparations. Large-scale bungling in the administration of reparations gave Zakhandanov the opportunity he wished. Through Mikoyan, he instigated an attack on Malenkov's handling of reparations and recommended that dismantling be replaced by the setting up of Soviet-owned corporations to take over German industry in Germany to make goods for the Soviet Union. As a consequence of this failure, Malenkov, with his associates, was demoted from several of his posts for about a year, June 1947 to June 1948. Immediately after his rehabilitation, Zakhandanov died mysteriously, and his chief supporters were arrested and shot. The so-called Leningrad case. In the meantime, Khrushchev was deeply involved in the effort to restore the collective farms, which had suffered great attrition during the war, and the more difficult task of bringing them under party control. In view of the ruthless way in which the collective farms had been established in 1928 to 1934, it was not surprising that neither the farms nor the party were popular with the peasants. Both were quietly sabotaged in ways which could neither be observed nor prevented, especially as party members and the secret police were both rare in rural districts. Evidence for such sabotage could be seen in the constant failure of the agricultural section of the economy to fulfill quotas or expectations, in the fact that the peasants produced 4 times as much in yield per unit acres on their small personal plots of ground as they did on the wide acreage of the collective farms, and in the fact that farm animals in 1953 were well below the figures for 1928, while cows were 13% fewer than in 1916, despite a population increase of 25% from 1928 to 1953. Moreover, in the confusion of the war, At least 15 million acres of land belonging to the collective farms had been diverted to peasants' private plots, while millions of peasants on the collective farms were living in inefficient semi-idleness. Early in 1950, Khrushchev returned from 12 years of party butchery in the Ukraine and took over the agricultural problem. His solution, totally unworkable, was to move more vigorously in the Stalinist direction of increased centralization. He wished to merge the collective farms into increasingly large units and to work the peasants in increasingly large work brigades in order to bring them under the control of the few Communist Party members to be found in the countryside. A party cell required 3 members as a minimum, and in 1950, a substantial fraction of the existing collective farms had no party cells at all, while the majority had cells of less than 6 members each. In 2 years, by merging collective farms, Khrushchev reduced the total number of such units from 252,000 to 94,800, but 18,000 still had no party cells, while only 5,000 had cells with over 25 members. Khrushchev wanted to carry the process of concentration even further by destroying the existing villages and centralizing the peasants in large urban settlements, so-called agro-towns. In such towns, they would be remote from their small private plots, would not spend so much time on them, and would be escorted in large gangs out to work each day on the collective fields. This fantastic scheme was blocked by Beria and Molotov in 1951. Another scheme, which may have been associated with Khrushchev, was vetoed by Stalin in 1952. This would have distributed the personnel and machinery of the Rural Machine Tractor Stations, MTS, among the collective farms, thus, at one strike, increasing the locally available party members from their personnel to build up rural party cells, and making available, at short notice, necessary farm machinery. This suggestion was blocked by Stalin as a step backward from socialism. In its place, he suggested that the peasants' incentive to work on his private plot to produce for sale in the private market be destroyed at one blow by forbidding the peasant access to any market, or even to money, by forcing him to dispose of all his surplus produce on a barter basis to the state. On the whole, Khrushchev's achievements as agricultural leader were far from successful, but this did not injure his reputation with Stalin, who recognized his personal devotion and energy and saw that his efforts were directed toward increasing party control in the countryside rather than the desirable, but clearly less important, goal of increased production. As a mark of this favor, at the 19th Party Congress in October 1952, Khrushchev presented the report on the new party rules and saw one of his supporters, A.B. Aristov, take over charge of all personnel appointments in the wide-spaced party network. Both of these developments were at the expense of Malenkov, the nominal head for party matters, but the latter was more than compensated by the privilege of taking Stalin's place as the chief party speaker in an 8-hour speech at the Congress. As this Congress of October 1952 assembled and dispersed, Stalin was already laying the groundwork for his third great purge of the party. No one, except perhaps Beria, could guess who was a target for elimination, but the rumors and hints from Stalin's personal secretariat made it appear that every one of the old guard of Stalinists should fear the worst. From October 1952 onward, these chief associates of Stalin lived in mounting terror. Like gangsters of the Capone era, They did not dare go out of their homes at night, ventured nowhere without personal bodyguards, and carried weapons on their persons. Beria remained dominant until November 1952. Because Moscow was garrisoned by secret police divisions, the Kremlin Guard was entirely in his control, and no one else was allowed to bring weapons into that enclave. Stalin moved with his customary skill, steadily dispersing and diluting the authority of the old guard. The number of ministries was increased. The Politburo ceased to meet. Its 10 members were dissolved into a large presidium of 36, and the old guard were shifted from operating ministries to posts without portfolios. Molotov from Foreign Affairs, Kaganovich from Heavy Industry, Nikolai Bulganin from Defense, Mikoyan from Trade. The last of these shifts, in November 1952, was the replacement of Beria as Minister of State Security by S.D. Ignatiev. By that time, Poskribyshev and his assistant, Mikhail Ryumin, were already preparing the frame-up of Beria. This was the so-called doctor's plot, a fabrication which pretended that Zhdanov and other leaders had been poisoned by a group of Kremlin doctors, mostly Jewish, who were, with Beria's knowledge, about to carry out a similar elimination of other leaders, including high military officers, under torture so severe that 2 of the 9 doctors died. The rest gave confessions. At this point, just when the purge was to begin, Stalin died, possibly from a series of strokes on March 5, 1953. Within 6 hours, the physician in charge of Stalin's last few days, Stalin's son, Vasily, who commanded the Air Force of the Moscow military district, Poskribyshev, and the commanders of the Kremlin, the city, and the local military district all disappeared. Beria was recalled from semi-exile to lead the merged ministries of Interior and State Security, and the administrative changes since October 1952 were undone. The large presidium was replaced by the previous smaller Politburo of 10 men. The number of ministers was reduced from 55 to 25, and the inner cabinet was cut from 14 to 5. Most significantly, the old guard, which Stalin had been slowly moving away from, the levers of power, were, at his death, quickly moved back to the center. Malenkov was made secretary of the party and premier of the government, with 5 deputy premiers: Beria, Molotov, Bulganin, Kaganovich, and Mikoyan. Each of these was restored to his previous ministry, while Voroshilov became chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet. Marshal Zhukov was recalled from rural exile to be first deputy to Bulganin in the Defense Ministry, and Khrushchev, with no major post, was made chairman of Stalin's funeral obsequies. Under his care, the deceased autocrat's body was placed, with the reverence becoming a demigod, alongside that of Lenin, in the shrine overlooking Red Square. Then, at Premier Melenkov's request, Khrushchev took over one of his 2 posts, that of secretary of the party. It was a fateful change. During Stalin's rule, the autocrat had held both chief positions, in the state and in the party. Now, a week after the despot's death, the universal distaste for any revival of his power compelled Melenkov to yield up one of the positions to Khrushchev. We do not know why he decided to keep the premiership and give up the secretaryship of the party. Indeed, we do not know if he had any choice, but it may have seemed, from the evidence of Stalin's later years, that the premiership was a more significant post than the secretary's. It was not, certainly, it was not in the hands of a tactician such as Khrushchev. During the next 5 years, in a struggle for power whose details are still concealed, Khrushchev rose from the secretary's post to be supreme autocrat, eliminating in the process all other possible claimants to power. The process by which he succeeded Stalin was almost a repetition of that by which Stalin had succeeded Lenin. In each case, the ultimately successful contender was the least prominent of a group of contenders. In each case, this victor used the post of secretary of the party as the chief weapon in his upward rise. In each case, this rise was achieved by a series of chess moves in which the most powerful rival contenders were eliminated one by one, in a series of shifts, beginning with the most dangerous. In one case, Trotsky; in the later case, Beria. And in both, this whole process was done under a pretense of collective leadership. Immediately after Stalin's death, the collective leadership was headed by a triumvirate of Malenkov, Beria, and Molotov. Malenkov supported a policy of relaxation with increased emphasis on production of consumers' goods and rising standards of living, as well as increased efforts to avoid any international crises which might lead to war. Beria supported a thaw in internal matters, with large-scale amnesties for political prisoners, as well as rehabilitation of those already liquidated, at home and in the satellite states. Molotov continued to insist on the hard policies associated with Stalin. Full emphasis on heavy industry, no relaxation of the domestic tyranny, and continued pressure in the Cold War with the West. Wild rumors, especially among the satellites, and some relaxation at Beria's behest in East Germany, gave rise to false hopes among the workers there. On June 16, 1953, these workers rose up against the communist government in East Berlin. After a day of hesitation, these uprisings were crushed with the full power of the Soviet occupation armored divisions. Using this event as an excuse, the leaders in the Kremlin suddenly arrested Beria and shot him with 6 of his aides, either immediately or in December, depending on the version of these events. The overthrow of the Masters of Terror was supported by the regular army, whose chief leaders were present in the next room, armed with smuggled machine guns, when the showdown between Beria and his colleagues occurred in the Kremlin conference room. Beria apparently suspected nothing and set down his briefcase, in which he had a pistol hidden. During the conference, while one leader distracted his attention, another removed the pistol from the briefcase. Beria was then told he was under arrest. He dived for his briefcase, found his pistol gone, and looked up into the muzzle of his own gun. He was at once turned over to the army officers in the next room. These had already moved 4 divisions of their forces into Moscow to replace the usual secret police forces guarding the city. This use of the army to settle the personal struggle in the Kremlin is the chief factor which was different in Khrushchev's rise to power from the earlier rise to power of Stalin in 1924 to 1929. There can be little doubt that the introduction of this new factor was due to Khrushchev, and that his secret speech denouncing Stalin in February 1956 was part of his payoff to the armed forces for their role in the process. The overthrow of Beria was followed by an extensive curtailment of the secret police and its powers. Most of the latter went to the Interior Ministry, while its forces were subjected to separate control, and its system of secret courts was abolished. Many of its prisoners were released, and there was considerable relaxation of the censorship, especially in literature. Some of the powers of the police were taken over by the party. In February 1954, a large conference of agricultural leaders in Moscow was thunderstruck by a suggestion from Khrushchev for a radical new approach to the chronic agricultural shortages. This virgin lands scheme advocated opening for cultivation in Asia large areas of grassland which had never been cultivated before. Khrushchev's plan was detailed and dazzlingly attractive. It entailed use of over 100,000 tractors and great hordes of manpower to cultivate grain on 6 million new acres in 1954 and an additional 25 million acres in 1955. The scheme, carried out in an atmosphere of heated discussion, was not supervised by Khrushchev. Its requirements in machinery and equipment were so great that it represented a sharp restriction on Malenkov's shift of emphasis from heavy industry to consumer goods, while Khrushchev's refusal to supervise it placed the responsibility for its success at Malenkov's door. At the same time, Malenkov's public advocacy for a thaw in Soviet-American relations was equally weakened by the secret Soviet drive to perfect the H-bomb. While the undermining of Malenkov was thus in process in 1954, Khrushchev began to undermine Molotov in the foreign field by organizing a series of spectacular foreign visits without the foreign secretary. One of the first of these, in September 1954, took Bulganin, Khrushchev, Mikoyan, and others to Peking to celebrate the 5th birthday of Red China. During the visit, Khrushchev apparently made a personal alliance with Mao Zedong, as well as a complicated commercial treaty which offered Soviet finance equipment and specialized skills for an all-out industrialization of China, the so-called Great Leap Forward. These events made it possible for Khrushchev to organize a campaign against Malenkov during the winter of 1954 to 1955. Ostensibly, this was based on Malenkov's desire to relax the intense emphasis on heavy industrialization, but in fact, Malenkov's lack of aggressiveness in foreign policy was equally significant. In combination, the two issues created pressure which Malenkov could not resist. On February 8, 1955, his resignation was read to the Supreme Soviet. He assumed responsibility for the unsatisfactory state of Soviet agriculture. He relinquished the post of premier, although remaining on in the Central Committee in the new post of Minister of Power Stations. The new premier was Bulganin, who released his previous post of Defense Minister to his deputy, Marshal Zhukov, hero of World War II. These struggles within the Kremlin are based on persons, not on issues, since the latter are used chiefly as weapons in the struggle. In the shift from Malenkov to Bulganin, the critical issues were the chronic agricultural problem and the choice between Stalin's policy of relentless industrialization, regardless of the cost to peasants and workers, and a new policy of increased consumers' goods. In this last issue, the needs of defense brought Khrushchev support from Marshal Zhukov, the armed forces, and the Stalinists, such as Molotov and Kaganovich. Zhukov was rewarded with a ministry and a seat in the Presidium, the only army officer ever to have the latter. The gradual elimination of Molotov found Khrushchev on the opposite side of the Stalinist versus anti-Stalinist debate, as champion of a thaw in the Cold War. This involved a rejection of Stalin's doctrine of the inevitable enmity of non-satellite countries and the inevitable onset of imperialist war from capitalist aggression. In this struggle, Khrushchev found support in Bulganin, Mikoyan, and probably Zhukov. The new policy was established while Molotov was still foreign minister through a series of elaborate state visits by Bulganin and Khrushchev, B and K as they were called, to foreign countries. The most significant of these visits, because it marked a sharp reversal both of Stalin and of Molotov, was a 6-day visit to Tito and Yugoslavia in May 1955. This acceptance of Titoism is of great importance because it showed Russia in an apologetic role for a major past error, and because it reversed Stalin's rule that all communist parties everywhere must follow the Kremlin's leadership. The Belgrade Declaration admitted that different countries could walk different roads to socialism, and that such differences in the concrete application of socialism are the exclusive concern of individual countries. Khrushchev and Tito both knew that this statement was playing with fire. The former's motives are obscure. It was probably done simply as a challenge to Molotov's whole past record. Tito unquestionably hoped the dynamic would explode sufficiently to blow the East European satellites out of Soviet control. With his customary shrewdness, Khrushchev did not sign the Belgrade Declaration himself, but had Bulganin, the new premier, do it, thus protecting himself from direct responsibility if anything went wrong. This declaration was not the only stick of dynamite which Khrushchev was juggling as he returned from Yugoslavia. En route home, he stopped off in Bucharest and Sofia. In the latter capital, he placed the fuse in another, even larger stick of dynamite, by a secret denunciation of Stalin personally as a bloodthirsty tyrant. Back in Moscow in early July, Molotov made an uncompromising attack on the Belgrade Declaration, denouncing it as encouragement to the satellites to pursue independent policies, a consequence which all agreed would be totally unacceptable to anyone in the Kremlin. But Khrushchev won over the majority by arguing that the loyalty of the satellites, and especially their vital economic cooperation, could be ensured better by a loose leash than by a club. He scorned Molotov's opposition to an agreement with Tito by contrasting it with Molotov's agreement on August 1939 with Ribbentrop. The solidarity of the satellites was to be preserved by the Warsaw Pact of May 14, 1955, which established a 20-year alliance of the Soviet Union, Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and East Germany. This was the communist riposte to NATO, which the newly sovereign West German state had joined as a 15th member 5 days earlier, May 9th, 1955. Straight from his arguments with Molotov in the Central Committee, Khrushchev dashed off with Bulganin, Molotov, and Zhukov to the 1955 summit meeting in Geneva. There he kept quietly in the background, while his companions discussed the fate of Germany with President Eisenhower, Dulles, Eden, and premier foe of France. The 1955 summit conference at Geneva on July 18th through the 24th was Anthony Eden's contribution to the thaw. Dulles participated most reluctantly, but there had been increasingly unfavorable comment on his inflexible attitude toward the Russians, and he felt compelled to yield to Eden's insistence in order to help Eden's Conservative Party in the British general elections of May 1955. Once these were successfully passed, the meeting had to be carried out, but Dulles had no hopes of its success. He contributed little in this direction himself when he insisted that disarmament must be discussed before German reunion. Outsiders tried to interpret the Russian attitude toward the thaw on the basis of no reliable information, placed much greater hopes in the summit meeting than Dulles did, chiefly because of the surprising Soviet shift which had produced the Austrian peace treaty of May 15, 1955, with its subsequent evacuation of Austria by Russian troops. The Austrian treaty restored the country's frontiers of January 1938 and promised free navigation of the Danube, while prohibiting any union with Germany and binding Austria to neutrality. The neutralization of Austria gave rise in 1955 to a good deal of vague talk about disengagement in Europe. The idea, however defined, had considerable attraction in Europe, even for experienced diplomats like Eden. Nothing very definite could be agreed upon as making up disengagement, but everyone was eager for anything which would reduce the threat of war, and the Germans especially had longing thoughts of a neutralized and united country. France, which was deeply involved at the time in Indochina and in the Muslim countries, particularly Algeria, was eager for any relaxation in Europe which would allow a breathing spell to devote to its colonial problems. To help the discussion along, the Russians spoke favorably about disarmament, Europe for the Europeans, and German reunion. When details of these suggestions appeared, however, they usually justified completely Dulles's skepticism. Disarmament, for example, meant to the Russians total renunciation of nuclear weapons and drastic cuts in ground forces, a combination which would make the United States very weak against Russia, while leaving Russia still dominant in Europe. Sometimes this result was sought more directly: withdrawal of both the United States and the Soviet Union from Europe, the former to North America, thousands of miles away, and the latter merely to the Russian frontiers. Another Russian suggestion was to replace NATO with a European Security Pact, which would include only European states. The Soviet suggestions for Germany were equally tricky, and show clearly their fear to subject their East German satellite to a popular election, and their real reluctance to see Germany united. They demanded unification first and elections later, while the United States reversed the order. The merging of the two existing German governments, followed by a peace treaty along the lines of the Austrian treaty, would have given the Russians what they wanted in Europe: a Germany freed from Western troops, ruled by a coalition government, which would allow elections when it judged best.